The road to Silent Hollow wound its way through dense, mist-laden woods, their skeletal branches clawing at the overcast sky like the gnarled fingers of an ancient spectre. I gripped the door handle of Elliot's beat-up Chevrolet Impala, a relic as weathered and worn as its owner, and stared out at the unsettling wilderness. The silence out there felt oppressive, smothering, almost alive. I couldn't help but feel like the forest was watching us. Elliot, ever the stoic figure, sat beside me, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as though he could drive straight through the mystery we were chasing. He wore his signature brown leather jacket, scuffed and frayed at the edges, a testament to years of chasing ghosts, conspiracies, and the truths no one else dared to unearth. His knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. I had learned to read him like a book, and today, he was particularly tense. "Do you know what it is about places like this?" Elliot's voice broke the uneasy stillness inside the car. It was gravelly, weighted by years of inhaling cigarette smoke and exhaling doubts. Places like Silent Hollow seem cursed. Like something went wrong here long before anyone can remember. "Maybe it's the silence that curses them," I replied, attempting a small smile to mask my own unease. Silent places attract loud secrets. His lips twitched, but he didn't look at me. The deflection had failed, he wasn't in the mood for banter. The town came into view like a photograph drenched in sepia, a tableau frozen in time. Weather-beaten houses slouched against each other, windows darkened and lifeless. The streets were empty, save for a dog dragging a mangled leash across the cracked pavement. A church bell hung crookedly in its tower, silent like everything else. Silent Hollow, I thought, was aptly named. We pulled up to the town square, where the heart of the village, or what remained of it, might once have beat. Elliot stepped out of the car first, stretching his tall frame and brushing off invisible dust. I followed, the cold air biting at my cheeks and carrying the faint smell of something earthy and decayed. I scanned the surroundings as Elliot lit a cigarette and stared at the ground, lost in thought. "They're not going to like us being here," Elliot murmured, smoke curling from his lips as he spoke. "They? The elders?" I asked, recalling the murmurs we'd heard about Silent Hollow's shadowy council, the keepers of the town's grim secrets. "Not just them," Elliot said, flicking ash onto the cracked asphalt. "No one here wants outsiders poking around. Especially not in things that should stay buried." The first person we encountered was an elderly woman sweeping the porch of what must have been the town's general store. Her stooped figure and hollow eyes seemed carved from the same wood as the surrounding houses. Elliot approached her with a kind but firm demeanor, pulling out the photograph of the symbols we'd found etched into the ground near where the children had vanished. The symbols had haunted me since the moment I first saw them. Elliot began, his voice measured and calm. "We're looking into some unusual occurrences in Silent Hollow. Have you seen anything like this before?" Her broom froze mid-sweep, her eyes darting to the photograph for the briefest of seconds before she looked away. "No," she said curtly, resuming her sweeping with an aggressive vigor. "Are you sure?" Elliot pressed. The woman gripped the broom tighter, her knuckles turning as pale as the mist that clung to the trees. I said no, she snapped, retreating into the shadows of her porch. Elliot looked at me and shrugged. It wasn't surprising, fear had a way of making people unhelpful. We decided to visit the town hall next, a decrepit building with peeling paint and shattered windows. The door creaked ominously as Elliot pushed it open. Inside, the musty smell of damp wood and rotting paper greeted us. Rows of dusty filing cabinets lined the walls, their labels faded beyond recognition. At the far end of the room, a man sat behind a desk, his gaze fixed on a yellowed ledger. His face was sallow and gaunt, as though he had absorbed the decay around him. Elliot cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir. My name is Elliot Brooks. This is my colleague, Miguel Vasquez. We're investigating the disappearances that occurred here 2 years ago." The man looked up slowly, his expression wary. "I don't think I can help you," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "We're not looking for much," Elliot said, his tone disarming yet insistent. "Just anything you might know about these symbols." He handed over the photograph. The man hesitated, his fingers trembling as he took the photograph. His eyes widened as he studied the symbols, his breath quickening. Those are forbidden," he said, his voice shaking. "You shouldn't be here." "What do you mean by forbidden?" I asked, stepping closer. He shook his head violently, thrusting the photograph back at Elliot as though it burned his hands. "Leave," he said, his voice rising. "Leave before they find out you've been asking questions." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Who's they?" "The elders?" The man froze, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone, or something, to burst through. "I've said too much," he whispered, before turning back to his ledger and refusing to speak another word. Back on the street, Elliot let out a frustrated sigh. "This place is a fortress of fear and silence," he said, lighting another cigarette. I nodded, scanning the town square again. There was something deeply unsettling about Silent Hollow. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way the silence seemed to crawl under your skin, burrowing into your thoughts and amplifying every fear and doubt. I felt watched, though I saw no eyes upon us. As the afternoon wore on, we decided to head toward the swamp where the children had disappeared. It was there, according to the scarce reports, that the symbols had first appeared. The swamp lay on the outskirts of Silent Hollow, its edges shrouded in a fog so thick it seemed to have a mind of its own. Elliot led the way, his boots squelching against the muddy ground. I followed closely, my senses heightened by the oppressive atmosphere. The swamp was eerily quiet, no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. The only sound was the occasional drip of water from the skeletal branches overhead. And then we saw them, the symbols. Carved into the bark of a twisted, ancient tree, the symbols seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, their grooves glowing faintly in the dim light. Elliot stopped in his tracks, his cigarette falling from his lips as he stared at the markings. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping closer. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The symbols were identical to those in the photograph, but seeing them in person was far more unnerving. They felt alive, as though they were watching us, judging us. Elliot reached out to touch the tree, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Miguel, if we're going to understand what happened here, we have to take risks." I reluctantly released his arm and watched as he traced his fingers along the grooves of the symbols. The moment he made contact, the air around us seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier. A faint whispering filled my ears, though there was no one else around. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. Elliot pulled his hand back, his face pale. "We're not alone here," he said. I didn't need to be told, I could feel it, too. Something, or someone, was watching us from the shadows of the swamp. Silent Hollow was a place where secrets thrived, and we had just scratched the surface. The thick fog curled around us as Elliot and I trudged deeper into the swamp. Silent Hollow's eerie silence wasn't just behind us, it seemed to follow, woven into the air like a palpable force. My boots sank into the soggy ground with each step, the sucking sounds blending with the occasional drip of unseen water. The tree with the sinister symbols was still etched in my mind as though it had branded itself there. Those grooves, glowing faintly like veins of dying embers, had whispered to us, and I wasn't sure my mind would ever fully recover. Elliot, walking just ahead of me, had shifted into his determined investigator mode. He wasn't speaking, not to me, not to himself, but his movements carried an urgency that I hadn't seen before. A cigarette dangled loosely from his lips as his eyes darted between the twisted trees that surrounded us, their skeletal branches reaching for the sky. "Anything?" I finally asked, trying to pierce the thick veil of silence between us. Elliot turned slightly, just enough to let me see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Not yet," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly, like the swamp itself had stolen his energy. The landscape grew increasingly surreal as we ventured further into the swamp. The fog didn't merely cling to the trees and ground, it seemed to pulsate, moving with an almost deliberate rhythm. My heart pounded as I noticed strange shapes looming in the distance, only to vanish when I focused on them. It was as though the swamp was playing tricks on us. Elliot stopped abruptly and crouched down. I followed his gaze to a cluster of strange impressions in the mud, footprints, but not the kind you'd expect from a human. They were narrow, elongated, with an unnatural symmetry that sent a chill down my spine. "Animal tracks?" I ventured, though the words felt hollow. Elliot shook his head. "No. Not animal, not human." He glanced at me, his jaw tight. "Whatever made these, it doesn't belong here." I didn't reply. What could I say? That it looked like something dragged itself from another world? That the swamp seemed to echo every fear I'd ever harbored? Instead, I swallowed my anxiety and crouched beside him. "I'll document these," I said, pulling out the camera slung around my shoulder. My hands shook slightly as I took the photos, the click of the shutter sounding strangely loud in the oppressive silence. I half expected the swamp to react, to shift or rebel against our intrusion, but nothing happened. "Let's keep moving," Elliot said, rising and brushing the dirt from his knees. His cigarette was gone, stubbed out at some point during his analysis. The absence of smoke added to the sense of vulnerability creeping up my spine. We pressed onward, the footprints leading us deeper into the swamp's heart. The trees grew denser, their twisted limbs forming grotesque shapes. One tree resembled a hunched figure, its bark warped and split to resemble a screaming face. Another looked like arms reaching desperately upward, clawing at the mist for salvation. "You feel that?" Elliot's voice broke the silence again. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what that was. The air had grown heavier, pressing against my chest and making it harder to breathe. My skin tingled with a sensation I couldn't describe, as though static electricity was dancing just above the surface. It was suffocating. "Something's here," Elliot muttered, his tone sharper now. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I scanned the swamp, my eyes flitting from one shape to another, but there was nothing, no movement, no shadow. Just the fog, the trees, and the suffocating silence. Elliot pulled out his flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the fog, revealing more twisted trees and, in the distance, a strange structure. It was small, hunched against the swamp like a forgotten relic. As we approached, its details became clearer, a stone altar, cracked and weathered, with symbols carved into its surface. "Looks like we found something," Elliot said, his voice steady but laced with an undertone of unease. I stepped closer, my heart pounding as I examined the symbols. They were similar to those on the tree, but not identical. These were more intricate, more deliberate, as though they held a deeper meaning. My fingers itched to trace the grooves, but I held back, remembering what had happened at the tree. Elliot didn't share my hesitation. He crouched beside the altar and ran his fingers along the carvings, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "These symbols," he muttered, more to himself than to me, "they're part of the same pattern." "What pattern?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer immediately. His focus was entirely on the altar, on the symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly under his touch. Finally, he spoke. "A summoning." I felt the air leave my lungs. "You think someone summoned the Bog Man?" Elliot shook his head. "Not someone. The town." He stood up, his expression grim. "Silent Hollow's elders, they've been summoning the Bog Man. These symbols are the proof." I took a step back, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. Silent Hollow wasn't just cursed, it was complicit. The town's secrets ran deeper than I could have imagined. Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the swamp, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My blood turned to ice as I scanned the trees, searching for the source. "Stay close," Elliot said, his voice steady but low. He was already reaching for his gun, the flashlight trembling slightly in his other hand. The growl came again, louder this time. It was followed by a sound I couldn't place, like wet footsteps slapping against the muddy ground. My pulse raced as I turned in circles, searching for movement. And then we saw it, a shadow in the fog, moving unnaturally fast. It was humanoid but twisted, its limbs elongated and bent at impossible angles. The fog seemed to part around it, as though it carried its own aura of terror. Elliot raised his gun, his hand steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "Stop," he called out, though his voice betrayed no confidence that it would obey. The shadow didn't stop. It moved closer, its features becoming clearer, a face gaunt and hollow, with eyes like empty sockets. The symbols from the altar seemed to shimmer across its skin, as though it had been branded with them. Elliot fired, the gunshot cutting through the oppressive silence. The shadow recoiled, disappearing into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. The swamp grew still again, but the tension remained. "We need to go," Elliot said, his voice sharp. I didn't argue. As we retraced our steps, my mind raced with questions. Who, or what, was that shadow? Was it the Bog Man? Or something worse? Silent Hollow's secrets weren't just buried, they were alive, waiting to be uncovered. And whatever had been summoned, it wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. The dim light filtering through the broken panes of the Elders' meeting hall barely illuminated the room, leaving the far corners shrouded in shadow. We had managed to secure a meeting with them after hours of probing around Silent Hollow, pestering anyone who would talk to us until we found a reluctant informant. It had been an exhausting game of persistence and subtle threats, a skill Elliot wielded with precise expertise. Now, standing before them, I was beginning to doubt whether we should have pursued this lead. The Elders sat in mismatched chairs arranged in a loose semicircle around an ancient oak table marred by scratches and stains. Their faces were pale and drawn, deep lines carving paths across their skin like maps of their guilt. The air was thick with unease, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the room. It was impossible to ignore how their piercing gazes lingered on Elliot, then shifted toward me, narrowing with suspicion. Elliot was the first to break the silence. "We're here for answers," he said plainly, his voice echoing in the oppressive stillness. One of the elders, a wiry man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward. His presence exuded authority, though he spoke with a rasping voice that sounded as worn as the chair he occupied. "Silent Hollow doesn't take kindly to outsiders," he said. Elliot ignored the comment, his face an unwavering mask of determination. "We're investigating the disappearance of the children. 2 years ago, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind symbols that match others we found deep in the swamp. We need to know what happened." The elder leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "And why do you think we would know?" I exchanged a glance with Elliot, who remained firm. "Because this isn't the first time," Elliot said, his voice calm but resolute. "This town has secrets buried deeper than its roots." A murmur swept through the group of elders, soft but distinct, like the shifting of dry leaves underfoot. The silver-haired man raised a hand, silencing them. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. His tone carried an edge of finality, but I could see the flicker of something else in his expression, fear, perhaps. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the tension prickling my skin. "We're not here to make accusations. We're here to help. But in order to do that, we need the truth. The symbols we found, they're part of something bigger, something dangerous. And unless we understand what they mean, more lives could be at risk." Another elder, a frail woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through me, spoke up. "The symbols are forbidden," she said, her voice trembling. "They bring destruction and despair." The silver-haired man shot her a warning glance, but Elliot seized the opportunity. "Forbidden by who?" he pressed. "By you? Or by something you summoned?" The woman flinched, her frail hands clutching the edge of the table. "Enough," the silver-haired elder barked, slamming his hand against the wood. The sound echoed through the room, startling me. Elliot didn't budge. "You know something," he said, his voice low and steady. "And it's eating away at you. You can feel it, can't you? The guilt, the fear, it's written all over your faces. How many more children have to vanish before you speak up?" The tension in the room reached a breaking point. The elders exchanged nervous glances, their carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Finally, the silver-haired man sighed, his shoulders slumping as though he bore the weight of the world. "We didn't summon it," he said, his voice barely audible. "We appeased it." I felt my breath catch. "Appeased?" I echoed. The elder nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. "The Bog Man demands sacrifices. It's the only way to keep him contained. If we defy him," he trailed off, his trembling hands pressing against his temples. Elliot's jaw tightened. "And the children?" The elder's eyes met Elliot's, and for the first time, I saw the full depth of his pain. "The children were taken," he said. "We didn't choose them. We didn't want this." Another murmur swept through the group, but this time it carried an air of grief rather than fear. The frail woman bowed her head, her hands trembling. Elliot leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Where did the symbols come from? Why do they appear?" "They're his mark," the silver-haired elder said. "The Bog Man leaves them to remind us, to warn us." I felt my pulse quicken. "What does he want?" The elder shook his head. "I don't know. I only know what the elders before me passed down. The pact was made long ago, to protect the town from his wrath." Elliot was silent for a moment, his mind clearly racing. Finally, he said, we've seen the symbols in the swamp. And something else, a shadow. It looked human but twisted. What is it? The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. That's him, the frail woman whispered. The Bog Man. He watches us, always. To make sure we obey. The word sent a shiver down my spine. Silent Hollow wasn't just cursed, it was haunted, its fate tied to a dark entity that fed on the town's sacrifices. Elliot stood up, his expression grim. If you want to end this, he said, you need to tell us everything. No more half-truths, no more silence. If the Bog Man has a hold on this town, we need to find a way to break it. The silver-haired elder's gaze faltered. If you try, he said, he'll come for you. Elliot didn't flinch. Let him, he said, his voice steady. As we left the meeting hall, the weight of the elder's confession settled over us like a shroud. The night was dark and cold, the mist swirling around us as we walked back toward the car. Elliot didn't speak, his focus entirely on the path ahead. I don't like this, I finally said, breaking the silence. You're not supposed to, Elliot replied. But we're closer than we were. The elders know more than they're telling us. We'll get the truth out of them eventually. His confidence was reassuring, but the fear lingering in my chest refused to dissipate. Silent Hollow had revealed part of its secret, but the darkness still loomed, vast and impenetrable. The Bog Man wasn't just a myth, he was real. And whatever pact the town had made, it was about to unravel. The cold, unforgiving wind of the late evening sliced through Silent Hollow as Elliot and I stepped away from the elders' hall. The conversation we had just endured replayed in my head in a disjointed loop, every broken phrase, every haunted glance a thread tangled in the web of a mystery far darker than I could have anticipated. Elliot lit another cigarette as we walked. The dull orange glow flickered defiantly against the encroaching shadows of the town. He hadn't spoken since we left the hall, and his silence felt heavier with every passing moment. I matched his pace, listening to the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the frost-kissed ground. Finally, I broke the quiet. So, we're just going to leave it at that? The Bog Man demands sacrifices, end of story? Elliot exhaled, a stream of smoke dissipating into the chilly air. No, he said simply, his voice rough but steady. But if they're too scared to tell us the whole truth, we'll have to find it ourselves. And how do we do that? I asked, my frustration leaking into the question. By looking where they don't want us to, he replied, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the swamp. Come on. I sighed but followed without protest. The swamp seemed to loom larger in the night, its oppressive stillness amplified by the absence of moonlight. The fog had returned, thicker than before, and it clung to the ground like a living thing, curling around our legs as we trudged forward. You know, I said, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease, most people would call it a night after being warned about an ancient, child-snatching entity. Elliot smirked faintly but kept his gaze ahead. Most people wouldn't be here in the first place, Miguel. He wasn't wrong. Most people would have turned back long before this. Most people wouldn't have stepped foot in Silent Hollow. But Elliot wasn't most people, and neither was I, and not anymore. The tree with the symbols came into view first, its twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The carvings still glowed faintly, their light pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost alive. My stomach tightened as I approached, the memory of the whispering voices resurfacing with unnerving clarity. We're going back to the altar, Elliot said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Whatever's happening in this town, it started there. We moved quickly through the swamp, following the faint path we had taken earlier. The fog seemed to thicken with every step, muffling the sounds of our movements and swallowing the world around us. It felt as though we were walking through a dream, a dark, endless dream with no promise of waking. When we reached the altar, my breath caught in my throat. The symbols carved into its surface had changed. Where before they had been intricate but static, they now seemed to shift and writhe, their lines twisting in patterns that defied logic. The faint glow was stronger here, casting eerie shadows that danced across the gnarled trees. Elliot crouched beside the altar, his expression grim. "They're reacting," he said, more to himself than to me. "Reacting to what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He didn't respond immediately, instead reaching into his coat and pulling out the photograph of the symbols we'd found near the vanished children. He held it up beside the carvings on the altar, his eyes narrowing as he compared them. "They're evolving," he said finally, his voice low. "Changing. Adapting." "To what?" I pressed, my unease growing. "To us." The words hung in the air like a tangible weight. I took an involuntary step back, my eyes scanning the swamp for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the fog and the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. "Elliot," I began, my voice trembling, "maybe we should." A sound cut me off, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us. My heart raced as I spun in place, my flashlight sweeping through the fog in frantic arcs. The growl came again, louder this time, and was followed by a sound I couldn't place, a wet, slithering noise that set my teeth on edge. "We're not alone," Elliot said, rising to his feet. His hand went to his side, where his gun rested in its holster. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My breath came in shallow gasps as I strained to see through the fog. And then, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, I saw it, a shadow, hunched and twisted, its form barely distinguishable from the surrounding mist. "Elliot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I see it," he replied, his tone calm but tense. He raised his gun, aiming it at the shadow. "Don't move." The shadow didn't listen. It moved closer, its shape becoming clearer as it stepped into the light. My stomach turned at the sight. It was humanoid, but grotesquely distorted, its limbs elongated and its skin pale and mottled. Its face, or what passed for a face, was gaunt and hollow, its eyes empty sockets that seemed to pierce through me. "Back off," Elliot warned, his finger tightening on the trigger. The creature paused, its head tilting as though studying us. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a sound that defied description, a series of guttural clicks and hisses that sent a chill down my spine. Elliot fired. The gunshot echoed through the swamp, and the creature recoiled, letting out a piercing shriek that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It disappeared into the fog, leaving only the lingering echo of its cry. "Come on," Elliot said, grabbing my arm. "We need to move." We ran, our boots slipping on the muddy ground as the fog closed in around us. The swamp seemed to come alive, the trees twisting and shifting as though trying to trap us. The growls and clicks followed us, always just out of sight. When we finally burst out of the swamp and onto solid ground, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. Elliot stood beside me, his chest heaving as he scanned the darkness for any sign of pursuit. "That thing," I managed between breaths, "what the hell was it?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. "The Bog Man." The name sent a shiver through me. We had seen him, or it, and survived. But I knew, deep down, that our encounter was far from over. Silent Hollow had shown us its darkness, and now there was no turning back. The morning after our encounter in the swamp felt strangely normal, as though the town itself had settled back into its false sense of serenity. Silent Hollow basked in the weak light filtering through the heavy clouds, but the swamp lingered in my mind like a fever dream. The smell of damp earth and the guttural growls that had followed us seemed to seep into every thought. I knew we were on borrowed time. Whatever the Bog Man was, or whatever it wanted, it hadn't left us untouched. Elliot was already pacing in the motel room when I returned with coffee. He had been awake for hours, judging by the number of cigarette butts scattered across the ashtray on the desk. His face was taut, his eyes sharp yet weary, a reflection of the weight we both carried. Without looking up, he muttered, "The elders are hiding something. We need leverage." I set the coffees on the desk beside him. "What kind of leverage are we talking about?" They barely acknowledged the symbols, let alone the Bog Man. He looked up, finally meeting my gaze. "The Pact. If the Bog Man's been tied to this town for decades, centuries, even, then there's a record. Something documented. The elders inherited their roles. They didn't invent this nightmare." His logic was sound, though it made my stomach twist. A tangible record of Silent Hollow's pact would mean undeniable proof of its darkness, but it also meant the depth of their complicity was far greater than we had imagined. "And where do you propose we start looking?" I asked, taking a cautious sip of my coffee. "Their archives? Their homes?" He shook his head. "Not yet. I want to start with the church." The church. The structure had been hard to miss when we first arrived, the bell tower looming crookedly over the town square like a guardian forced to watch the decay beneath it. Its windows were darkened, its doors weathered, its walls seemingly scarred by time itself. There was something inherently unsettling about its presence, though I hadn't been able to place why. "You think the church is involved?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Elliot grabbed his coat. "I think it's where people go to hide sins they don't want seen." The church was even more imposing up close. The wooden door groaned under Elliot's touch as he pushed it open, revealing an interior as cold and lifeless as the town itself. Rows of pews stood empty, their varnish worn and dull. A faint smell of incense lingered in the air, a futile attempt to mask the rot creeping through the walls. Elliot stepped inside first, his flashlight sweeping over the dim space. "Look for anything unusual," he said, his voice low. "Documents, carvings, whatever catches your eye." I nodded and moved toward the altar, its surface bare save for a tarnished brass chalice and a dusty Bible. My fingers traced the edge of the chalice as I scanned the area, looking for anything out of place. It didn't take long to notice the faint grooves etched into the stone beneath the chalice, symbols, barely visible but unmistakable. "Elliot," I called, my voice echoing slightly. He was by my side in an instant, his flashlight illuminating the markings. "Same symbols," he murmured. "They've been hiding them in plain sight." I crouched beside him, studying the grooves more closely. "Do you think the elders know?" "They know," he said firmly. "Whether they acknowledge it is another story." We began searching the rest of the church, careful to avoid disturbing anything unnecessarily. In the back room, where the priest's modest quarters were located, we found an old wooden chest tucked beneath a faded rug. Elliot pulled the rug back and pried the chest open, revealing a stack of yellowed papers tied together with twine. "What are these?" I asked, leaning in. Elliot untied the twine and began sifting through the papers. Most were written in a dense, elaborate script, but their content was unmistakable: records documenting the town's pact. Names, dates, descriptions of rituals performed to appease the Bog Man. My stomach churned as I read over Elliot's shoulder. "Children," I whispered. "They've been doing this for decades." Elliot's jaw tightened. They were willing to sacrifice their own to save the town. I stood back, unable to read any further. The papers felt like they were burning my skin, each line a confession too terrible to process. Silent Hollow's darkness was far deeper than I had imagined. The elders weren't just complicit, they were orchestrators. "We need to confront them," I said, my voice trembling. "They can't keep hiding behind silence." Elliot shook his head. "Not yet. If they know we have these, they'll try to stop us. I want to know more about the Bog Man first, his origins, his connection to the town." "And how do we find that?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Elliot placed the papers back in the chest and retied the twine. "Lost Lake." I froze, the name sending a chill down my spine. Lost Lake was miles away, but its connection to Silent Hollow was undeniable. The signals, the hallucinations, the faint hum we had heard on the military base. And now, the Bog Man. "You really want to go there?" I asked, though I knew his answer. "We have to," he said. "Whatever's been summoned here started there. The elders won't talk, but Lost Lake might." The drive to Lost Lake was long and unnerving. The road twisted through dense forests that seemed to mirror the darkness we had left behind in Silent Hollow. The clouds hung heavy overhead, their presence oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though there was no one else around. Elliot drove in silence, his focus entirely on the road ahead. The papers we had found were tucked safely in the glove compartment, their weight pressing against my thoughts. I wanted to believe we could unravel this mystery, but the deeper we dug, the more tangled it became. When we finally arrived at Lost Lake, the atmosphere was even worse than I had imagined. The water stretched out like a black mirror, its surface perfectly still. The trees surrounding the lake were skeletal, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick with the faint hum we had heard before, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Elliot parked the car and stepped out, his eyes scanning the area. "Let's find the source." I followed reluctantly, every instinct in me screaming to turn back. But there was no turning back, not now. The truth was waiting, and we couldn't stop until we found it. As we approached the water's edge, the hum grew louder, almost unbearable. My vision blurred slightly, and I felt a strange pressure in my head, as though the lake itself was pushing against my thoughts. Elliot stopped suddenly, his flashlight illuminating a structure partially submerged in the water. It was rusted and battered, but unmistakable, a submarine, its hull scarred and broken. "That's it," he said, his voice steady but low. "That's where the signals are coming from." I stared at the submarine, my heart pounding. Whatever was inside, whatever artifact had caused the signals, was tied to the Bog Man. And now, it was calling to us. The shoreline of Lost Lake was eerily quiet, save for the low hum that seemed to resonate through the very ground beneath our feet. It wasn't natural, it was mechanical, unnatural, almost alive, and it vibrated through my chest like the distant toll of a bell. The submarine, resting partially submerged at the lake's edge, loomed like a rotting skeleton, its corroded hull reflecting faintly in the dark water. The sight of it left me cold. It felt wrong, not just because it was out of place, but because it radiated a presence. Elliot stood beside me, his flashlight casting long, sharp shadows across the uneven shoreline. He hadn't said much since we got out of the car. That was his way. When he was focusing, words became an unnecessary distraction. I, on the other hand, couldn't stay silent when my nerves threatened to boil over. "Tell me again why we're walking into that thing?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Elliot pulled his flashlight higher, illuminating the jagged opening in the submarine's hull, just above the waterline. The metal around the breach was warped and rusted, sharp enough to tear through flesh without hesitation. The eerie, faint hum seemed louder now, leaking out from the darkness within. "We need to know what's inside," he said simply. His voice was calm, steady, but I could see the tension in the lines of his jaw. "And if what's inside doesn't want us there?" I muttered, tightening the strap of my bag over my shoulder. In it, I carried everything I thought we might need: notes, a recording device, a camera, a handgun I barely knew how to use. The weight of it all was nothing compared to the growing sense of dread pressing against my chest. Elliot shot me a glance, one of his trademark looks that could mean either "you're overthinking" or "shut up and follow me." Without another word, he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the rocks. I sighed and followed him, my flashlight cutting weakly through the encroaching fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. As we approached the submarine, the air grew colder, the hum louder. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts, forming small clouds in the air. The breach in the hull was large enough to climb through, though it didn't look particularly inviting. The sharp edges of the metal seemed to glint menacingly in the dim light. Elliot paused at the opening, inspecting it carefully. "Hold the light," he said, gesturing for me to aim my flashlight at the breach. I obeyed, watching as he pulled out a thick pair of gloves and carefully tested the edges. "Stable enough," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I shifted nervously, glancing back at the still, dark waters of the lake. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from just beneath the surface. "Let's make this quick," I said. "Being here feels like tempting fate." Elliot didn't respond. He hoisted himself up, gripping the edges of the breach and pulling himself inside with practiced efficiency. For a man who often complained about his knees, he moved with surprising agility. I wasn't quite as graceful, and my climb into the submarine was accompanied by a fair amount of grunting and the awkward clinking of my flashlight against the metal. Inside, the air was damp and stale, carrying the scent of rust and decay. The floor sloped slightly, and water pooled in the lower sections, reflecting the beams of our flashlights with an unnatural sheen. The walls were lined with broken consoles, their dials and switches long corroded and coated in a thin layer of grime. Everything about the interior screamed abandonment, yet the hum persisted, constant and oppressive. Elliot moved ahead, his flashlight scanning the narrow corridor. "Look for anything unusual," he said. "Define unusual," I muttered, though I was already examining the walls and the consoles. There were markings here, numbers, faded labels, even a few scrawled messages in what looked like grease pencil. None of it made sense to me, but then again, I wasn't the investigator. I was the one who tagged along and tried not to die. As we moved deeper into the submarine, the hum grew louder, pulsing in a way that made my teeth ache. I could feel it in my skull, a relentless vibration that made it hard to think clearly. My flashlight flickered once, then again, before stabilizing. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. "Feel what?" Elliot replied without looking back. Like pressure in the air. It's hard to breathe. He paused for a moment, then nodded. We're close. Close to what? I didn't know, but the unease in his voice did nothing to reassure me. The corridor opened into a larger room, a space that might have once served as the submarine's control center. The consoles here were in slightly better condition, though still ravaged by time. In the center of the room stood a pedestal-like structure, its surface polished to an almost unnatural shine. And on that pedestal sat the source of the hum. It was a small, rectangular object, no larger than a book, its surface etched with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. The artifact. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, radiating an energy that made the air feel electric. Elliot approached it cautiously, his flashlight trained on the object. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at me to keep my distance. He shook his head. "I don't know. But it's not from here." "Not from here as in, not from Silent Hollow? Or not from this planet?" I joked weakly, though the look he gave me made it clear he wasn't in the mood. "It doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is figuring out why it's here and how it's connected to the Bog Man." Before I could respond, the hum shifted, growing deeper, more resonant. The walls of the submarine seemed to vibrate with the sound, and the air grew colder. My flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging us into darkness. "Elliot," I began, but my words were cut off by a sound that froze me in place. A low, guttural growl, echoing through the confines of the submarine. It was the same sound we had heard in the swamp, but this time it was louder, closer. "Stay calm," Elliot said, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. He reached for his gun, the click of the safety releasing sounding unnaturally loud. The growl came again, accompanied by the faint sound of wet footsteps. My heart raced as I fumbled for the spare flashlight in my bag, my hands shaking. When I finally managed to switch it on, the beam illuminated the corridor we had just come from, and the figure standing at its far end. It was the Bog Man, or whatever passed for him. Twisted, elongated, and impossibly grotesque, his pale, mottled skin glistened in the weak light. His empty sockets fixed on us, and for a moment, the hum seemed to stop altogether, replaced by the sound of my own panicked breathing. "Run," Elliot said, his voice low and urgent. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the corridor, our footsteps splashing through the water as the growls and wet slaps of pursuit grew louder behind us. The submarine seemed to twist and shift around us, the narrow corridors closing in, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. When we finally burst out through the breach and onto the shoreline, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. Elliot stood beside me, his gun still raised, scanning the water for any sign of movement. The lake was still again, the hum gone, but the sense of dread remained. "We're not finished," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the tension in his body. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. Whatever the artifact was, whatever the Bog Man wanted, we were in far deeper than I had ever imagined. And there was no turning back. The stillness of Silent Hollow that morning was suffocating, its usual, oppressive silence weighed down further by the dread Elliot and I carried back from Lost Lake. Even in the light of day, I could feel the eyes of the swamp and its phantom whisper, a chill that seeped into my skin and stayed long after we'd returned. Elliot sat at the motel desk, his jaw locked, his hands busy piecing together fragments of notes and photographs. His cigarette burned in the ashtray, untouched, its smoke curling lazily upward. The artifact from the submarine had haunted us all night, even though we left it buried beneath the lake's black surface. I swore I could still hear its hum, faint and persistent, like a phantom itch. Elliot had refused to leave it alone. Answers don't come to those who wait, he had said, his eyes bloodshot as he pored over the photographs we had taken. Answers. The word felt hollow now. We can't keep dancing around this, I said, breaking the weighty silence. The elders know more than they're letting on. We have the proof. It's time we forced their hand. Elliot leaned back, rubbing his temples. We show our cards now, they shut us down, or worse. Whatever power they think they're dealing with, it's got them terrified. Desperation makes people dangerous. More dangerous than a reality-warping artifact and a demon in the swamp? I asked, though I already knew his answer. Still, the thought twisted my insides. We've seen what this thing can do. You've seen it. Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rose, reached for his jacket, and tossed me mine. We're out of time, Miguel. Let's pay them a visit. The walk to the Elders' Hall felt longer this time. Silent Hollow's narrow streets watched us pass, empty but alive with the weight of unseen gazes. The distant church bell tolled once, but there was no service. The sound hung in the cold air long after it faded. When we reached the hall, the same silver-haired elder greeted us, his eyes narrowing. He stood in the doorway like a sentinel, blocking our entrance. You weren't invited back, he said tersely. We're not here for tea, Elliot shot back, stepping forward. We found this. He held up a photograph of the altar in the swamp, the glowing symbols carved into its surface stark against the murk. And this? Another photograph followed, the logbook from the submarine, detailing the artifact's transport and a chilling phrase scrawled in the margin, *object amplifies reality distortion. The elder's face paled, his bravado faltering. Behind him, the frail woman from before shuffled into view, her sharp eyes wary. You shouldn't have gone looking, she said, her voice trembling. You shouldn't have lied, I countered, stepping up beside Elliot. You told us the Bog Man leaves his mark. But this? This is more than a mark. It's a calling card. And we've seen what answers it gets. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their fear plain as day. Finally, the silver-haired man stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. The hall was colder this time, its shadows longer despite the midday light. The semicircle of elders gathered again, though their numbers seemed fewer. I wondered if some had fled, unwilling to face the truths we were dragging into the light. You've brought trouble, the silver-haired elder said as we sat across from them. Trouble's already here, Elliot replied, tossing the photographs onto the table. Tell us everything, the pact, the artifact, the Bog Man. No more half-truths. The elder sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of decades of secrets. The pact was made long ago, before any of us were born. The town was dying, plague, famine, war. People prayed for salvation, but it never came. Not from above, anyway. He paused, his gaze distant. The Bog Man came from the swamp, offering prosperity in exchange for sacrifice. At first, it was livestock. Then, crops. But it was never enough. He demanded more. Children, I said, my stomach turning. The elder nodded grimly. Every few decades, he marked his claim with symbols. The town elders obeyed, ensuring his demands were met. And the artifact? Elliot pressed. That he came later, the frail woman said. During the war. The submarine brought it here, though I don't know how. The artifact and the Bog Man, they feed off each other. The pact was bad enough, but the artifact made it worse. It amplifies his power, his reach. We've tried to contain it, to keep the town safe. Safe? I snapped. You call this safe? Those children. We had no choice, the silver-haired elder interrupted, his voice shaking. The pact cannot be broken. To defy him is to bring ruin. Elliot leaned forward, his eyes cold and sharp. That's where you're wrong. Every pact has a weakness. And we're going to find it. Our next stop was the church. Elliot believed the elders' predecessors had hidden more than just symbols there, rituals, instructions, something we could use. I wasn't so sure, but I trusted him. He had a way of finding threads where others saw nothing. The church was empty, its pews as lifeless as before. The faint smell of incense lingered, though it couldn't mask the underlying scent of decay. We moved quickly, searching the altar, the pulpit, the back rooms. It wasn't until Elliot pried open a loose floorboard beneath the altar that we found what we were looking for. Beneath the floor lay an old, leather-bound tome, its cover cracked and faded. Elliot opened it carefully, the yellowed pages crackling as he turned them. The text was dense and archaic, but the diagrams were clear enough, rituals, symbols, and one phrase repeated again and again. Asterisk, the cycle must be broken. Asterisk. This is it, Elliot said, his voice low but determined. The elders were wrong. The pact can be broken. Before I could respond, the air shifted. The faint hum from Lost Lake returned, growing louder, more insistent. My vision blurred, and I felt the same pressure I had experienced in the submarine. He knows, I whispered, gripping the edge of the altar for support. Elliot didn't hesitate. He tore the page with the ritual from the tome, stuffing it into his pocket. We need to move. Now. As we left the church, the hum followed, vibrating through the air, the ground, my very bones. The shadows of the town seemed to stretch and twist, their edges sharp and menacing. Silent Hollow wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was closing in on us. Elliot's pace quickened as we made our way back to the motel. We'll need supplies, he said. Candles, salt, chalk, anything to replicate this ritual. And then what? I asked, struggling to keep up. We face the Bog Man? With what? Words and symbols? With everything we've got, he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. The motel came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a deep, suffocating darkness. The hum was deafening now, a relentless pulse that drowned out all other sounds. I could feel him, the Bog Man, his presence closing in, his hollow eyes watching from the edges of my mind. As we entered the motel room, Elliot locked the door behind us, his movement swift and deliberate. This is it, he said, spreading the torn page out on the desk. This is how we end it. I stared at the symbols, the instructions, the faint, desperate scrawl of whoever had written them centuries ago. The cycle must be broken. The words echoed in my mind, their meaning clear, but their promise uncertain. Are you ready? Elliot asked, his gaze steady. I wasn't. But I nodded anyway. The night descended heavily over Silent Hollow, wrapping the town in a shroud of unnatural darkness that seemed to pulse with the low hum emanating from somewhere deep within the swamp. Elliot and I prepared in silence, the motel room illuminated only by the flickering light of a single lamp. The torn page from the ancient tome lay on the desk, its symbols etched into my mind like a curse. Salt, candles, and chalk lined the table, hastily gathered from the town's sparse general store. My hand shook as I arranged them, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me. Elliot was calm as always, though his steady demeanor was tinged with an edge of tension I hadn't seen before. He checked his gun, loaded it with precision, and holstered it beneath his coat. His gaze drifted to the ritual instructions, his jaw tightening as he studied the steps we had to follow. Neither of us had said much since we decided to perform the ritual. There was no room for doubt, but the silence was suffocating. I broke it first. "Do you think this will work?" My voice sounded small, barely audible over the hum. "It has to," Elliot replied, not looking up from the instructions. "If we don't stop the Bog Man now, no one will." I wanted to believe him, but the fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. The memories of the swamp, the submarine, the twisted figure of the Bog Man, they all swirled in my mind, feeding my growing dread. I swallowed hard and turned back to the supplies, focusing on the task at hand. When everything was ready, Elliot glanced at me. "Let's go." The swamp was alive in a way that defied logic. The mist clung to the ground like a living thing, curling around our legs as we walked, while the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and shift, watching us with an unseen presence. The hum was louder here, resonating through the air, the ground, my very bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, pressing against my chest with every step. Elliot led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. I followed closely, clutching the bag of supplies as though it might shield me from the horrors lurking in the swamp. The altar came into view first, its twisted surface glowing faintly in the light. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the hum, alive and ancient. "We start here," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the tension in his body. I nodded, my hands trembling as I pulled the supplies from the bag. The chalk felt heavy in my grip as I began to trace the symbols onto the ground, replicating the patterns from the torn page with painstaking precision. Elliot placed the candles around the altar, their small flames flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. The salt formed a protective circle, a barrier against the unknown. When everything was in place, Elliot stepped back, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "Ready?" I wasn't. But I nodded anyway. He lit the candles one by one, their flames casting eerie shadows across the altar and the surrounding trees. The hum grew louder, deeper, resonating through the swamp like the toll of a bell. My chest tightened as I felt the air shift, growing colder, heavier. The ritual had begun. Elliot's voice broke the silence as he recited the words from the torn page, his tone steady but commanding. The language was unfamiliar, guttural and harsh, yet it carried a weight that seemed to reverberate through the swamp. I repeated the words after him, my voice trembling but determined. As the chant grew louder, the hum changed, twisting into something darker, more menacing. The ground beneath the altar began to tremble, and the mist thickened, swirling around us in an unnatural dance. The symbols glowed brighter, their light pulsing in time with the chant. And then the shadows came. They emerged from the mist, twisted and elongated, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. They moved with unnatural speed, circling the protective barrier like predators stalking their prey. My heart raced as I clutched the bag, my eyes darting from one shadow to another. They were watching, waiting. Elliot didn't falter. His voice rose above the hum and the whispers, commanding the ritual with an authority that seemed to challenge the swamp itself. The shadows drew closer, their forms becoming clearer, more grotesque. Among them stood the Bog Man. His hollow eyes locked onto us, and the hum ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The swamp seemed to hold its breath as he stepped forward, his twisted form illuminated by the flickering candlelight. His presence was suffocating, a weight that pressed against my chest and stole the air from my lungs. Elliot held his ground, his voice unwavering as he continued the chant. The symbols on the altar pulsed brighter, their light forming a barrier that held the Bog Man at bay. The shadows writhed against it, their forms clawing at the air, but they couldn't break through. The Bog Man tilted his head, studying us with an unnerving curiosity. And then he spoke, not in words, but in a sound that defied description, a guttural, otherworldly noise that resonated through the swamp. My vision blurred, and I felt a sharp pain in my skull, as though the sound itself was tearing through my mind. Elliot's voice faltered for the first time, and the barrier weakened. The shadows surged forward, their forms pressing against the protective circle. I scrambled to reinforce the salt line, my hands shaking as I poured the last of the salt onto the ground. The Bog Man's presence grew stronger, his hollow eyes fixed on Elliot. "We have to finish!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the chaos. Elliot nodded, his jaw tightening as he regained his focus. His voice rose again, commanding the ritual with a determination that seemed to challenge the Bog Man directly. The symbols pulsed brighter, their light forming a barrier once more. The Bog Man let out a deafening roar, his form twisting and contorting as he surged against the barrier. The ground beneath the altar cracked, and the mist exploded outward, enveloping everything in its path. I fell to the ground, clutching the bag as I shielded my face from the blinding light. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The hum ceased, the mist cleared, and the swamp grew still. The Bog Man was gone, and the symbols on the altar faded into darkness. The candles flickered weakly, their flames barely clinging to life. Elliot stood motionless, his breath heavy as he surveyed the scene. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw the weight of what we had just done reflected in his gaze. "It's over," he said, though his voice carried no relief. I nodded, rising to my feet and gathering the supplies with trembling hands. Silent Hollow's darkness had been challenged, but the weight of its secrets remained. As we left the swamp, the faint whisper of the Bog Man lingered in the air, a reminder that some cycles aren't easily broken. The dawn came, reluctant and muted, bathing Silent Hollow in a dim light that barely seemed to penetrate the heavy mist lingering over the town. I sat on the motel bed, staring at the torn ritual page spread across the desk. The candle wax from the swamp clung stubbornly to the edges, dried and warped, the reminder of the battle we had fought the night before. My hand still trembled, my chest tight from the lingering echoes of the Bog Man's roar. It felt as though his presence had branded itself onto my very soul. Elliot was by the window, his silhouette etched against the weak glow of morning. He hadn't said much since we returned to the motel. There was no satisfaction in his stance, no relief in his rigid posture. He stared out into the street like a man waiting for a storm he knew would come. The ritual had worked, or it seemed to. The Bog Man had vanished, his twisted form consumed by the flickering light of the symbols. But Silent Hollow didn't feel saved. The weight of the pact, the artifact, the swamp itself, all of it hung over the town like a sickness refusing to leave. "Do you think it's over?" I asked finally, breaking the stifling silence. Elliot didn't turn to face me. "I think we bought time," he said, his voice low. But time's not enough. I rubbed my temples, the ache behind my eyes a constant reminder of the ordeal. The pact's broken. The elders can't use it as an excuse anymore. Maybe that's enough to start something better. Elliot chuckled humorlessly, a sound that carried no joy. You think they'll change, Miguel? They've been keeping this town alive by throwing children to the wolves, or worse. People don't change overnight. And Silent Hollow? Silent Hollow doesn't want to change. His words stung, but they weren't wrong. The elders had orchestrated decades of sacrifices, feeding the Bog Man in exchange for prosperity. The town had thrived on bloodshed and secrets. And now, those secrets were exposed. I stood, grabbing my coat as the heaviness in the room became unbearable. We should talk to them. Elliot turned to me, his expression unreadable. Talk? About what? About fixing this. About finding a way to heal the town. If they won't listen, then we'll make them. The elders' hall was colder than ever, its shadows longer despite the faint morning light. They were waiting for us, seated in their usual semicircle, though their numbers had dwindled further. The frail woman was absent, leaving the silver-haired elder as the sole speaker for the group. His face was pale, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Whatever power the Bog Man had exerted over them had left its mark. You've done something, the silver-haired elder said as we entered. His voice was clipped, almost accusatory. The swamp is quieter. The symbols, gone. We did what you couldn't, Elliot replied sharply, his stance firm. We broke the cycle. The elder's lips pressed into a thin line. You think you've saved this town? He asked bitterly. You haven't. The Bog Man will return. The swamp doesn't forget. Elliot stepped forward, his voice rising. The swamp isn't the problem. You are. The pact wasn't forced on you, you made it. And now you have a choice. Do you rebuild, or do you let this town rot? The elder's gaze faltered, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Elliot's words. The other elders shifted uneasily, their silence speaking volumes. Finally, the silver-haired man sighed, his voice trembling as he replied. Rebuild what? The children are gone. The town is poisoned. There's nothing left to save. There's always something, I said, stepping forward. The pact is broken. The Bog Man is gone. You can fix this if you choose to. The elder looked at me, his expression hollow. Fixing doesn't undo what's been done. No, Elliot said firmly. But it's a start. The drive out of Silent Hollow was quiet, the town fading into the rearview mirror as we left its darkness behind. The mist clung to the road, the trees, the buildings, refusing to let go. The weight of the town's secrets hung over us like a shadow, a reminder of the cost of survival. Elliot drove, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw tight. I watched the landscape shift, the dense woods giving way to open fields. The air felt lighter here, though the ache in my chest remained. You think they'll change? I asked, my voice soft. Elliot didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were measured. Maybe. Maybe not. But the cycle's broken, Miguel. That's all we could do. I nodded, leaning back in my seat as the tension eased. Silent Hollow wasn't saved, but it wasn't doomed either. The Bog Man was gone, the pact shattered. What happened next was up to the people who remained. As the horizon stretched before us, I let the memories of the swamp fade, though they would never truly leave. Silent Hollow was a place of shadows, but even shadows can break beneath the weight of truth. For now, that would have to be enough.